What is China's endgame in the global economy, and how does India's rise play into this? Hello, everyone. Welcome back to China the News. I'm Christine Ying, and today we're exploring China's long term strategy and its relationship with India. Joining me to break this down is my co host and dear friend Doug Guthrie, China scholar and professor at Thunderbird School of Global Management at ASU. Before we dive in, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insights into China's global impact. Doug, has China been laying the groundwork for this moment for decades, or are they adapting as they go?
Oh, great question. And thanks for talking to me about this stuff, Christine. I'm very passionate about where we are headed in the world and China's role in the world. And this is a really, really important topic. So thanks for having the conversation with me. And so to your question, have they been laying the groundwork for this moment for decades, or are they adapting as they go? Um, well, I think this is really a moment of adaptation. But there's a long process that's been in play. This goes back to 1979 when Deng Xiaoping launched China's reform and opening up period. And we've talked in this show about, his traveling to the United States in February of 1979 and really things just completely transforming for China and its role in the global political economy. And since then, leaders like Jiang Zemin, who was president from 1993 to 2003, and he was my sort of the first leader I worked under when I was in China, when I was a doctoral student doing my dissertation research in 1995, 96, 94, 95, 96. I thought a lot about Jiang Zemin, but more importantly about Zhu Rongji, who was premier from 1998 to 2003, because they were really the two architects of China's role in the global political economy in terms of building the manufacturing supply chain and building the capabilities and securing technology transfer. This was back in a time before China was in the WTO, and it was very clear in China that if you wanted to enter China as a foreign company, an American company or a European company, you had to do what was called a quid pro quo for market access, which meant you had to basically build a joint venture and do something that would allow you to get into China, which meant you had to agree to transfer technology, and you had to really help work with the Chinese government in building this immaculate manufacturing supply chain that would emerge over the course of the next decades. And so that was really the focus of that time. Now, when China entered the WTO in 2001, it became illegal by WTO standards to have a quid pro quo for market access, but China had already gotten so much of the technology that they wanted from so many foreign companies that they were on their way to really building a powerful system. And so the next step was China's entry into the WTO, and China would then become a key player in the global economy. It was an amazing time.
Well, in earlier episode you talked about entry to WTO means there's no more forced technology transfer by foreign enterprises, correct?
Correct. So one of the legal aspects of the WTO is you can't have a quid pro quo for market access, which means what you can't do is say, okay, Apple, do you want to be in China? Then you're going to have a joint venture and transfer technology, right? And you and I've talked about Apple a lot in episodes here, and Tim Cook took Apple into China in 2001, right after China's entry into the WTO, and so it was illegal to have that quid pro quo for market access. And it just really changed the positioning because China had already gained a lot from the technology transfer agreements that had happened in the 1980s and 1990s. But they had to change the approach that was going to be happening in the 2000s.
So going back a little bit, we talked about two leaders in China focus on building out China's manufacturing capability and securing technology transfer. One is the president, Yiming,
Jiang
Zhang
Zemin.
Zemin. The other one is Zhu Rongji. What's the difference between the role of a president and a premier in
Well,
China?
so classically, I mean, if you look at you know, particularly these two, but I think you can map this onto the next 2 decades as well that follow with Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, and then with Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang. Um, the president is really the leader, right? So the president is the leader of the party. Sometimes in China they get upset or nervous when I refer to uh, Chairman Xi as President Xi, but officially he is Chairman Xi because he's chairman of the party, but his title within the political structure is the president. And so the president is the leader of the nation. The premier is, in some ways, it's not right to think about an analogy like a vice president, but it's really the person who's viewed as carrying out the operation of society and, most importantly, the economy. So again, under Jiang Zemin, there
It's
was the
like a chief operating officer in a company,
yes, exactly. That's a great
and the
analogy.
president's the CEO, and then the
Yeah,
COO is the premier.
beautiful. Yeah, yeah,
Okay, okay,
good. Yeah.
okay. But who speaks externally? Would it be the president or the premier?
The president. So the
Okay.
premier is really the person who's sort of, yeah, I like the analogy of COO because it's the person who's really kind of rolling up his sleeves and really helping the local governments, provinces, and municipalities figure out how to build the economy, how to control things in terms of social issues. And yeah, it's the person who's really got their sleeves rolled up and making things work. And the spokesperson for everybody, the titular head, is the president.
Thanks. Well, let's talk about Chinese leadership. So then under Hu Jintao, president from '03 to 13, and Wen Jiabao, premier from '03 to 13, China became deeply tied to the global economy. But then when Xi Jinping took over, that focus shifted, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was again these. If you think about these periods of epochs, you have Deng Xiaoping's leadership in the 80s, and then you have Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji in the 90s, and then Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao in the 2000s, from 2003 to 2013. Um, these were epochs of leadership in which we had a big focus on getting China into the global political economy under Deng Xiaoping, and then technology transfer and building the manufacturing supply chain through that technology transfer. And then China's entry into the WTO really changed things. And so it was a moment when China couldn't have a quid pro quo for market access, but it also was the manufacturing supply chain was very powerfully built at this point. And so it was really a time when they could start to be in the global political economy. This is also, as we all remember, a sort of time of radical change in terms of things like internet technology. And we see the emergence of companies like Alibaba. And so this was just a really sort of remarkable time in terms of China's opening up. We see Apple enter China and really kind of build out a vast array of social networks in terms of the supply chain. China's entry into the global political economy was really moving fast at this point. When Xi Jinping comes into power, we see just immediate cracks in that surface, right? And so I always like to tell the story that Xi Jinping was inaugurated on March 14th, 2013, and on March 15th, 2013, March 15th of every year is something called Consumer Day. And the leaders of China, usually pick a foreign company to call out and send a signal to. On March 15th of 2013, Apple was called out on Consumer Day, and there was a number of things that Apple it was claimed in the Chinese media that Apple was doing wrong, and it was sort of a signal to foreign companies that were operating in China that things were going to be a little bit different. Now, it didn't suddenly change under Xi Jinping; it would be a gradual transformation, but in 2014, we saw the release of a corporate social responsibility report that a number of companies were called out on. And then in 2015, we saw the dispatch labor system, which was a new set of laws that really changed the way that foreign companies could use the floating population, which was the cheap labor of China. And it just became clear that there was going to be a hunkering down of these issues. There was also another interesting thing that happened. You'll remember we've talked in the past about the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative was officially put forward as an idea as early as 2008 under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, but nothing was really done with it. It wasn't really sort of thought of as a serious thing. It was just sort of an idea about how China could use the concepts of the the road that was the Silk Road that Marco Polo walked, and the Belt, which was the idea of the the path through the South China Sea and up through Africa. So China could be sort of positioning itself to build the supply chain that was pivoting away from its dependence on the United States. And so, this was a really important time. That didn't really become, it was officially thought of as an idea in 2008, but it didn't really become a reality until 2013 under Xi Jinping. And so we just see a number of these moments when Xi Jinping looks like he's really trying to kind of rein China in and make sure that we're not just dependent on relationships with the United States and Europe, and we are going to continue to really build a position as the leader of the global South. So it was a really interesting change in the focus under Xi Jinping.
Thanks. But then now the current trade war during Trump administration seemed like a wake-up call. So do you think Xi Jinping was already moving in this direction to shift to global South, or was it just reaction to what US was doing in the first Trump administration?
Um, well, I mean, it's a little of both. I mean, China had already started preparing for less reliance on the West, and again, the Belt and Road Initiative was sort of the starting point of that. Um, but the trade wars really sped things up, and we started. Again, Xi Jinping was already really kind of laying the groundwork for this pivot from 2013 through 2016. But then when President Trump was elected the first time, we really started to see, an acceleration of this shift. And so, President Xi realized that partnerships like BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now BRICS has been sort of expanded to include several other countries, but back then it was just those nations, was really about, again, moving away from a strict adherence to and reliance on a bilateral trade relationship with the United States, and instead really focusing on other countries that were sort of out of that orbit. And so India, it looked like it was going to be critical to that future. And this was a good example of how China was positioning itself in relation to India, which had been a long-term rival. And so, it's a really interesting time. And so after years of mistrust, China facilitated a thaw in the relations between India and China at a meeting between President Xi and the Indian Prime Minister Modi. And this happened in October of 2024. And, the meeting addressed a lot of issues. It resulted in a long-sought border agreement that led to a reduction in tensions along the Himalayan border between the two countries. There was reopening of direct flights between the two countries in January of 2025. And so, again, it looks very much like a thawing of the relationships. And this goes together with a sort of reinvigoration of the BRICS economy. And in China, you often hear people in Chinese talking about China's role in the global political economy as South-South relations, 南南合作, and also China being the leader of the global South. And so it, looks like there's the thawing of the relations with India look very strategic in terms of continuing to build that relationship. But still, there are a number of flashpoints, right? India's raised concerns about China's plan to build a massive dam around the Yarlung Taopo River in Tibet. And it, that could reduce water availability in both India and Bangladesh. And so, this is kind of raises the tensions again. And, India may be taking a page from China's strategy when it recently launched joint naval exercises in Africa designed to boost relationships with African nations and possibly threaten China's dominance there. And so we're seeing, these two places that are really kind of central to the BRICS economy. I mean, together, this is 2.8 billion people, and the second largest economy in the world and the fifth largest economy in the world. But there's still some tension, and so it's interesting to look at what's going to happen there.
Speaking of the river, that reminds me of Colorado River. Just the water resources is a major problem on the West Coast where I live, where it's causing a lot of rift because Southern California is using so much water and there's allocation. Northern California really is under pressure, even though it doesn't directly rely on the Colorado River. So, yeah, water resources, it's definitely a major issue. Um, Doug, I know that OGL's China team has been analyzing the China-India dynamics closely. What's your team's take on how China views its relationship with India, especially within BRICS and the broader global strategy?
So I'm glad you asked this, Christine. I'm, as a scholar, I always like to, I like to work with experts like yourself and like my OGL China team, and I always like to learn and to make it clear when I've sort of haven't thought about things the right way. And when you and I were talking about this, maybe say a few months ago, 6 months ago, to me, it seemed very strategic that, okay, the thawing of the relationship between India and China and the reinvigoration or the kind of rebuilding of the importance and expansion of the BRICS coalition, it seemed to me that China was positioning itself to really kind of build a strong partnership with India. And that partnership seemed to me that, if China, a lot of Chinese companies want to go global. And so, it makes sense that China would be starting to invest in India. And we've seen one example of that, although it's Taiwan's investment. Foxconn has built a plant in Chennai so that they could be a final assembly place for iPhones. And so, I had sort of assumed that, okay, we're going to start to see this. Like the pivot away from the United States is going to be a pivot towards BRICS, and that includes India. Wow, what a powerful position. My China team disagrees, and I trust their insights on this. But basically, what their position is that um, if China's going to be really smart and think long term, we think about China's economic development over the last 4 decades. And China is a special place in terms of building this manufacturing supply chain because they had a lot of technology transfer from the West. They had a very large low-cost population. And even as that population became more and more expensive, they still have a huge floating population, about 350 million people that are called the Liudongrenkou, the floating population, the migrant labor force, many of who come from very poor parts of China, and they'll just move around the country and will be temporary labor for seasonal employment in the manufacturing supply chain. And so the only other country in the BRICS coalition that has that possibility is India, right? And so I had again been thinking like, okay, if things are getting, if China's needing to look for a place to expand, India is a perfect partner here, and the thawing of a relationship between Xi and Modi, maybe that's where this is going. My China's team says no. My China team is very clear on this, and their position is that if you think about how China develops in terms of its positioning in the global political economy and in this leadership of the global South position, India is the only one of the BRICS nation that could really rise to be a serious competitor 40 years from now. If India kind of followed the path that China followed over the last 40 years, what's to say that India couldn't build an immaculate manufacturing supply chain just the same way China has and have a migrant labor force, a floating population of 350 million people, and then be a direct competitor with China, which China hopes by then to be the largest economy in the world. And so my China team is very clear on this, where they say, Doug, you need to calm down on these views of China helping India develop, because China really sees India as a potential competitor of the future. And so, what China likes in terms of its positioning in the leadership of the Global South and the leadership of the Belt and Road Initiative countries is the way they frame it is China likes to help countries develop that can be viewed as sort of extensions of provinces of China, right? So if you think about a place like Vietnam, where, that Vietnam has developed as subsidiary manufacturing sites for a lot of companies that operate in China, including the company you and I used to work for, Apple. But the positioning is that, but Vietnam can never be a direct competitor of China, because Vietnam's a country of 95 million people with at most a labor force of about 30 million people. And so it's just, it can never compete with China, but it can always be a beneficiary of that competition. And so, I think it's just a kind of key thing to think about, you know, if the opportunity for the BRICS countries to be the dominant force in the global political economy and China to be the leader of it, that's one thing. But my China team is very clear on the idea that they do not want to help India rise to be a direct competitor of China. And so I think they're right. I trust their view.
Based on what you said, India doesn't seem to be the kind of partner China wants to work with. China often builds relationship with countries that rely on it economically or politically. And India, on this hand, have a very strong sense of independence. Am I hearing you right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's exactly their position, and it's the position that I'm taking in is that, um, India has the demographics and the infrastructure to be a direct competitor with China, and China doesn't want to help India do that. And so they do need to be partners, but they also China wants to contain the extent to which it'll let India be a competitor. And so, I think it's a complicated dynamic, and I think we're seeing President Xi just operate in the politics where he's thinking deeply about what China's future is, and what not just what the immediate future is, but what the long-term future of the next 40 years is.
Got it. Well, you mentioned Vietnam. So China prefers working with countries where it can take the lead, right? Like other Southeast Asian nations. ASEAN. I don't know, did I say that acronym correctly?
ASEAN.
ASEAN. India doesn't actually fit that mold, so it's hard. That makes it hard for China to manage. So I think they do work together for BRICS, but you're saying China really knows that India could become a serious competitor down the line.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I think this is really what is the key to this issue is that countries like Vietnam and a bunch of other countries in the South China Sea, they're always going to be smaller and subsidiary to China, whereas India, has the size, structure, and if they build it over the next 40 years, the potential infrastructure and the population where they could be a real competitor. And so, I think for China, they need India for building the BRICS, because India is part of the BRICS coalition. But China really wants to contain India in its growth so that it's clear that China continues in its position as the most powerful economy in the ASEAN nations. And
Well,
so,
draw another parallel to the world I live in, the businesses. This is a co-opetition, right? China sees India as both a partner and a rival. So, do you think this tension is shaping how China is approaching its overall global strategy?
I do. I mean, again, I think that when we think about China's overall global strategy, I mean, I think this has been the goal since, Deng Xiaoping was brought China back into the global political economy after a long period of isolation. Um, it's been on every leader's mind of how to help China grow and to position itself as one of the most powerful economies in the world. And again, under Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, it was much more of a laissez-faire system in which they were just sort of, enjoying being a part of the WTO and opening China up. But there wasn't really strict control and direction the way we're seeing under Xi Jinping. And so under Xi Jinping, we're sort of back to this model of China is very clear that it wants to be the largest economy in the world. And our team believes that is going to happen probably within the next 6 to 8 years. If they continue at 5% growth rates, that it looks like about six to 8 years that this would happen. Kind of depends on what the growth rate of the United States is during that period as well. But we believe that China is going to overtake the United States as the largest economy in the world. And we believe this is a part of the strategy. But again, part of the strategy is also to become a leader of the global South, which means just positioning itself as just a powerful player with a lot of other powerful nations, and not just therefore beholden to the United States and the European Union. And so I think that the economic growth and the sort of strategic positioning with respect to BRICS and ASEAN nations is really a critical part of China's strategy. But again, I think it's an interesting moment and an interesting dynamic, because under Xi Jinping, China has really worked hard to sort of reposition itself as not just the number one trading partner of the largest economy in the world, but really kind of stretch itself out and be positioning itself as the leader of all those nations, including India. So it's an interesting time.
Thank you. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the dynamics between China and India, what it means for the world. If you find this discussion valuable, we love your support. Please like this video so we can help reach more people, share with anyone curious about geopolitics and economics, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you so much, Doug.
Thanks for having this conversation, Christine. These are such interesting and important topics and times. And as you know, I'm very passionate about these issues, and I love talking about them with you. So thank you.
Thank you so much. To everyone else, see you next time. Bye bye.